Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Real Estate Development Insights podcast, where we bring you ideas, experiences, and best practices from the real estate development industry. My name is Payam Nursalahi. I'm the president of Delaware Project Management, a construction and project management firm that helps real estate developers define, design, and deliver successful projects. I have two guests for this episode. Both of them are returning as they've been here before, and I'm very grateful for them to join us again to have a more specific, more detailed conversation about the single-stair situation in the state of Toronto, specifically and overall in Canada. My guests are Conrad Specke, and Conrad is one of the most vocal people, most active people when it comes to the realm of single exit stair reform that has been happening in Canada and it's going on in Toronto right now. He has had a lot of contribution to the cause, and we're going to ask him on this episode about things that are going on. We also have Jack Keys from Vortex Fire. He's a code consultant, and he has been on the podcast before as well. And we will talk to him about the way that people are going about dealing with a single stair access situation in the residential buildings, specifically the alternative solution path, which seems to be the way people are getting these things approved. Very few of them have already been fully approved, but it's a crack. It's happening. So we'll learn from their experience, and both of them have had a significant role in making progress and making changes to the status quo and creating more flexibility for development projects and the developers themselves. As always, you can find more information about our episode and our guests on our website, realestatedevelopmentinsights.com, realestatedevelopmentinsights.com. And please remember to subscribe to the show, and even better, tell others about it and help us grow the show together. Thank you. Enjoy listening. Jack and Conrad, welcome back to the show. Thank you for being here. How are you doing today?
Good.
You guys have both been on the podcast before, so a lot of people might be hearing you the second time on the show. But for those of our audience who haven't heard you on the podcast before, can you give a 30-second introduction? Who is Jack? Who is Conrad? And I'll start with Conrad first, please.
Sure. Thanks, Pam. So I am a building code consultant and a designer in Toronto. Used to work for a number of years at a company called LGA Architectural Partners on a lot of missing middle housing projects. Sorry, my phone's going off here. And multiplex type work, and then also involved with zoning reform. But more recently have really been focused on building code issues and specifically single stair quite a bit.
Thank you. And Jack?
I'm a building code consultant and fire engineer. I've been working in this industry for over 20 years. Started out in super high-rise buildings in the Middle East, and I'm now gradually working my way back down to Part 9 and single stairways in much smaller buildings, which are much more difficult, believe it or not.
I do believe it. Most people work it the other way around, but
yeah,
I'm happy to have you here. Okay, so I asked you both to join us in this on the very specific topic of single stairs. A lot of discussions for us in the background over the years, and I know the two of you, among other people on your teams and bigger community, have done a lot, have worked on a lot of things. But for someone who's not very familiar to what we're talking about here, what the day-to-day impacts of this conversation is, Conrad, why is the single stair exit a big deal? Why do people need to pay attention to it, and how does it affect the project?
Yeah, thanks, Pam. That's a lot of questions, but I think maybe let me just start off making sure everyone knows what single stair means, because it gets described differently depending on who you're talking to about the subject. And from my perspective, and in the Canadian context, a single stair residential building is a small housing project, a multi-unit residential building, so not a house, sort of at that missing middle scale, so 3 to 6 stories in building height, where instead of when you enter the building, seeing an elevator lobby, going up that elevator, and then on each floor is a very long hallway with 2 staircases on opposite ends, and maybe 10 or even 20 apartments on each floor, which is very typical of what we see for residential buildings in Toronto and across North America. A single stair building means you go in, a set of mailboxes with maybe 10 or 20 mailboxes there, one elevator, You go up the elevator or you take the stairs to third, fourth, fifth, sixth floor of the building, but really no more than 5 or 6 stories in building height. And then when you get out of the elevator, you only see maybe 2 or 3, 4 apartments on each floor, right? There's not a super long hallway. The hallway is extremely short, and it's around one staircase. And so you're fundamentally changing the way that you think about apartment buildings, going from being buildings with 2 stairs and up to 100 or more apartments in it to a really small, more community-focused scale of building. And all that comes down to questions about fire safety, questions about what you do in the event of an emergency. But it's a real difference between the history of North American building codes that have had that requirement for 2 stairs since the 1930s. In Canada, we codified it in 1941 and haven't changed it since then, versus other parts of the world that really do things very differently and have millions of buildings that are built like this in their housing stock and a significant track record with seeing that it works for them.
Thank you. And I guess what we're trying to get at is that opens up more possibilities for these smaller buildings to be more flexible with design and potentially get more efficiency out of their floor plate. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, so then if we zoom into sort of the recent changes in the way that we build housing in Toronto, so if you're looking at a multiplex on a small lot, on a narrow lot, a 3-story building with 4 to 6 units, it changes the way you can configure the building and how efficient the building can be. It also means that instead of doing a design like a stacked townhouse, row house, back-to-back configuration where each unit has its own front door, you go into each unit, you're going up staircases, the buildings aren't sprinklered, they don't have fire alarm systems, etc. Instead of doing that, you're talking about a situation where you've got a common building entrance. You could actually lay it out with an elevator quite easily. And the floor plans are repeatable, your plumbing shafts and everything are aligned, and the floor plan stacks. And then
it's more like sorry to interrupt you, but it's more in the realm of like mid-rise to high-rise buildings where you try to get those efficiencies and repeatable patterns, basically.
Exactly.
Okay. And so, Jack, I want to go to you with this. So we have this thing that other places around this planet have figured out how to live with, and they've done quite a few buildings with them, or a lot of buildings with them. And we want to do it. Why can't we do it? What is it in our code and our system that prevents it?
It's kind of history is preventing it. If you want, like, we've always done it that way. That's what's, and in some ways, what's preventing it. It's been in the codes in Canada for a long time, as Conrad mentioned, 1941. And that's how we always do it. And that's how a lot of firefighting is set up. But what you'll notice with any code is the code, every time a new code edition comes out, they add and add and add, and things get better. 1941, I'm sure we weren't sprinklering very many buildings. Bear in mind, in Ontario, it's in my working career, we only started sprinklering high-rise buildings. It was like the 97 code, we didn't sprinkler high-rises. So there's been a lot of changes in that. And just in terms of firefighting capabilities, reliability of fire alarms, materials, construction standards, all these things have got better and better. But some of the baseline fundamentals of, hey, why have we got this in the code hasn't really been examined. And one of the challenges when you actually try and modify a code is you may not be able to pinpoint exactly where it came from in the first place. The exact reasoning in 1941 might have been as simple as, hey, 2 exits is good. One's blocked, you can get out the other one. That's a good approach. And it could be that simple. And I'm sure in a lot of ways it is. And there's a lot of logic there. Everything with that, when you look at the scale, and that's one of the things with these buildings is, and we've really had to try and convey that this is not a very big building. Typically, we're looking at a very small floor plate. Some of the early approvals we've got, the floor plate is quite small. The actual distance you have to walk, even from the street up to the top stairs, is quite short if you compare that to what you could end up walking in a high-rise, even not a high-rise building, much, much further. And what we've had after a while is like even a lot of the pushback is coming from various fire departments. But when we actually show them what we're looking at and the scale and how the additional measures we're adding to these buildings, it's making a lot of fire department personnel more comfortable with it. So I think that one of the key things is actually understanding where they fit in. And typically we see them as an infill project, smaller scale, 4 kind of units per floor. Even some of the ones we're starting with are only 2 per unit, 2 per floor. But they're really delivering a really livable building. I really like the buildings they're delivering. And I think it's where we have to really examine the fundamentals of the code and what we're doing. And we've demonstrated by risk assessment, by actual quantitative risk assessment on the recent project in Edmonton, where we're able to demonstrate that the proposed building is actually safer than a 2-stairwell configuration in terms of, or as safe as the code requires us to do.
We'll be right back.
Just a quick announcement. The recent changes in the City of Toronto have turned multiplexes into a very interesting opportunity and playground for new developers. To that end, we're testing interest in something new that we think will help these new developers. We're considering a small, application-only developer cohort for GTA property owners and developers to help them start a successful multiplex project in 2026. Consider it as a training camp before the Olympics. You've already decided that you want to build a multiplex. You either have the property or are able to acquire the property within the next 90 days, and you want to ensure you're in top-notch form before you put your capital at risk and start the project. If this is something of interest to you or someone else you know, please go to multiplexinvesting.com and we'll provide more information. Thank you. Okay, so we basically, my short summary of what you just said is that we're fighting somewhat of an invisible enemy and ghost of the past that's there. We just can't pinpoint it necessarily, but we need to overcome it somehow. Did I get that right?
Yeah, so in terms of, it's always been that way. And if you look at it in a very, hey, is 1 stairwell better than 2? Sorry, is 2 stairwells better than 1 stairwell? If you take a very, that's the only thing that matters, then yeah, you can make an argument that it shouldn't change. But there is a situation where we can demonstrate that we can increase other fire safety measures to compensate for having 1 stairwell. And when it is an invisible enemy at times in terms of trying to figure out exactly where the code came from at times. But there is legitimate concerns from the fire department. They have legitimate concerns and they have to be addressed.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's talk about, we had this for a long time. At some point, things started to change. My understanding is that the first domino was back in 2024 and in BC that they started changing. Is that correct?
Yeah, Payam, this conversation it's a bit of a perennial one in a sense. Back in the 1980s, in 1984, 2 architects wrote a report for CMHC, which talked about fire safety design comparing Europe and North America and showed that European apartment buildings were having better fire safety outcomes and were typically done as small single-stair footprints instead of long double-loaded corridors. Then in the 1990s, the Ontario Building Code, the provincial government put together a consortium that included an architect, a code consultant, and a cost estimator. And they made a list of 29 recommendations to change the Ontario Building Code to unlock Main Streets housing. Single-stair was one of the main recommendations in that report. And at the time, what happened was the report suggested that these buildings should be sprinklered, acknowledging that they could be wood frame construction, acknowledging that at that building height of 4 to 6 stories, sprinklers would make sense. And there was a huge pushback from industry, from builders saying sprinklers are very expensive. We'd rather have 2 stairs than sprinkler. And they didn't do a quantitative cost benefit analysis at the time to show that in fact the floor area savings would exceed the cost of sprinklering. They just said, okay, if you don't like this from industry's perspective, we're not going to pursue it. And of course, fire departments and the fire services also didn't like the idea at the time. Then in 2010, the province required sprinklering of all buildings of 4 or more stories anyways. So the entire argument to have not proceeded with single-stair in the 1990s was mute after 2010. But the government didn't go back to revisit the 1990s recommendations to say, okay, we've ratcheted up the level of performance in our codes since 2010. Is it appropriate that everything else stays the same, or what things could be addressed? And today we're in a situation, yes, myself and another fire engineer, David Hines, submitted a code change request in 2022 to the National Model Code System. But the province of British Columbia thought it was a good idea and wanted to lead. And so in 2024, the province of BC went ahead and changed the code independently. Ontario also said, the former minister, Steve Clark, and then also Paul Calandra, another former minister, both said that the province would do a consultation on 4 stories and 4 units per floor. And now we're into 2026, and we're in a situation where the province of BC has changed the code. The city of Vancouver has done a local code amendment to change their code. And I think the Ontario process is, I don't know where Ontario is at.
So I was actually hoping you can shed some light on Ontario and Toronto, because if I want to move to the next stage of a conversation here, is that I know both of you have worked on projects across Canada, and more specifically and more of interest to our audience potentially here in GTA, that have gotten approval in terms of going with a single stairs. And maybe I go to you, Jack. How did that happen? How do we get to an approval?
Yeah, so there's two approved. We've been involved, two that I know of. There's Conrad, you can correct me if there's more. We've been heavily involved in a project on Delaware Avenue where we took a really good design in terms of it's a 3-story building, absolute perfect scale for this, and took it through the alternative solution process. Big challenge there is just the timeline it took to actually get it approved. It did get approved in the end, but it required significant, huge effort in terms of building code consulting, justification, way more justification that you'd require for even other alternative solutions. It took a huge amount of work. A lot of the pushback came from through the city. We would respond to the city. The city would then go to the fire department. A lot of delays between different departments, and eventually it got approved. A lot of compensatory measures went into it. So sprinkling, obviously, different things, stair pressurization on that one to get it approved. But a long process. I think it took nearly a year in just the alternative solution alone to get it approved. So we had a very committed client, thankfully, and we had some funding as well that helped to support the cost. But it is a big, the challenge we're having with it is that, and we have more going in Toronto. And the challenge is, this is the reality with alternative solutions. The first one is the hardest to get approved. Always the hardest. Like we did all the mass timber stuff before with alternative solutions. Now it's in the code. It's just codified. Things we were doing 10 years ago are in the code now as of right. You can build. And we're hopefully going to see that at some stage with the single stairwell. The things we're doing right now will have probably a more streamlined version of it in the code in the future, I think is where it's going to go. Because usually when we do the first version, we have to add a lot of things extra to get it approved as compensatory measures. But I think if you look at what happened in all the the mass timber, the actual what's in the code is actually less than we designed originally. So that's where I see it going. But there are some other projects in the city of Toronto right now. We've 3 other alternative solutions in with the city, and we're hoping that they will be more straightforward. We're still getting some questions, but we're hoping it's a streamlined approach. One good thing that's happening with the city is that they're no longer assign projects based on geography only. They actually assign them by stream. So you can get the same person, whether you're in Etobicoke or you're in Scarborough, you can get the same person reviewing your file, which previously it wasn't. We would go to another essentially group. We would end up in the Etobicoke office, having come from a Scarborough office, and at the time didn't always communicate as well. So now we're at least able to get some of the same people onto the same files.
That's great. So you're hoping that, like, if you were to guess something from 12-month time period, are we down to 3?
Approved?
Yeah.
Oh, I think it'll be more than that. Yeah. No, I'm an optimist as well. It's a curse. So it's, I think we will. I think those other ones are following a very similar track to what we've already have approved. And I hope that they will be a more streamlined approval and get at least some industry acceptance from the AHJs of, hey, if you do it this way, we'll give you a permit. Bear in mind that there are certain alternative solutions out there that it's industry accepted how you get them. And if you do this, the city will give you a permit for an alternative solution. And I'm hoping we get that way with single stairwells, because that will at least allow us a reasonable path until a time when it's codified. And like what we're doing I think I've mentioned this before, we're not exactly innovating here in some ways. This is done in a lot of other countries. It's not like we're the first people to come up with this. I was in Italy last year, and I think we just heard back some good news on our alternative solution. It got approved, and I was actually staying in a building with a single stairwell. And it hadn't occurred to me with all the risk assessments. I just was walking in and out every day, and then wait a minute, this building has a single stairwell. I'm walking up and down it every day. So it's quite a common occurrence. And it's one of the things we've pushed back on a few times, going, hey, you're saying all these firefighting challenges in single stairwell. What does the UK do? What does Europe do? What does this country do? What are they doing in whatever location they have it allowed in? What's the key difference in the fire department response? So that's been one of the things we've pushed back with, is that, okay, I understand it's not exactly as we've always had it, but we can question what we're doing at times and ask for a reasonable reply to it.
The other thing, if I can jump in, Payam, is Canada's a bit of an island in the whole world on this topic. Like the only countries that have a code that's as strict as Ontario are Pakistan and Uganda and the city of Chicago. The entire rest of the planet doesn't have a code as strict as we do. And so even in the US, anywhere in the entire United States except the city of Chicago, you could build a 3-story sixplex or even a 3-story apartment building with 4 units on each floor with a single stair. And what the US IBC model code says is the building needs to be sprinklered. But in the Canadian context, because we're using alternative solutions where we're not just referring to what's permitted in a US code, but we're having to apply at the discretion of the authority having jurisdiction. So it's entirely at their discretion, regardless of your sort of precedent or technical basis that you can demonstrate, is ratchet up the requirements. And we're not just talking about sprinklering the building, but we're talking about leakage rated doors, right? So smoke gasketing the door frames and a whole bunch of other measures which I find fascinating. Typically, most of what's in our building codes is very similar to what's done in the US. A lot of our assumptions on travel distance, on stair tread, rise and run, etc., are very closely harmonized with what's in US code. And so one of the things I started looking at was, okay, so what's the history of what's in the US code? And it turns out that up until the early 2000s, the US model code also said you could only build to 2 stories with a single stair. But then when they looked at the reliability data they had on sprinkler systems and saw that sprinkler systems were performing 95, 98% reliable, even including sprinkler systems that aren't monitored by a fire alarm. So then they decided, okay, based on an understanding of how well these systems perform, let's increase that to 3 stories. And even the NFPA, which is another model code that the US has that's written by an organization called the National Fire Protection Association, they have a model code that says you can build single-stair apartment buildings up to 4 stories. And they've had it codified that way since the 1980s. We talk a lot about what's permitted in Europe and in Asia, and we see millions of these buildings. Entire city fabrics are constructed this way. But we don't actually even have to look that far. We can just look across the border to the way the Americans do this and realize that it isn't rocket science and that they've got this codified for many decades now.
Thanks for shedding some light on that. Yeah, it seems like it. I know I grew up in one of those single-stair 5-story 10-unit buildings, and we didn't even have sprinklers, but that's a different story. I want to come back to the actualities of what's happening in Toronto right now, and I'm not sure if this is a very fair question to ask the two of you, but I'll try. If I am a developer, if I have a project that I'm working on right now, and let's just break it up for argument's sake. If I have a multiplex type of project, which is, I believe, is still considered a Part 9, and if I have a mid-rise up to 6-story building, which is a Part 3 on the building code, like, first of all, which of the two would you say is more suited or more preferred to go through this route of trying to get their single-stair approval? And then maybe walk us through what does that entail in terms of requirements and trade-offs. You mentioned some of the items, I think, Conrad, but I don't know. Maybe we'll start with you, Jack.
If I understand the question, you're asking me what height we can get approved?
I'm trying to gauge it at this stage.
Every story you add, it gets harder. And that's essentially, I think there's going to be a fairly soon, I say, a three-story kind of approach we can take. And essentially, you're sprinkling a Part 9 buildings with a massive improvement in safety. The 4, 5, 6s are going to be hard realistically, and it's the first one out the gate is going to have a hard time, and you need a committed client. That's the reality of it. If you have a client who's dabbling their toe in this, like our client on the other two we're working on right now is an architecture firm, a very high-proven architecture firm, taking these through. He knows what he's getting involved in. He's well able to deal with it. He's dealt with many other developments as well, so they're experienced in the approval process. So I think that's going to be a key challenge, but also knowing how to navigate the city, who to talk to in the city, who to get you to help. You need some support that the community want this, and it's a very important project for the community. So yeah, but we're seeing, I think the 4 to 6s will be harder. I don't think anyone's tested them yet. Conrad, has anyone tried to 4 or 6 story yet in Toronto that you know of?
Yeah, there's a website called Single-Stair.ca where you can see 10 pilot projects across Canada. In Toronto, projects only applied that were 3-story buildings. And so one of the projects is from an architect office called Office U that Jack Keys was the co-consultant for, and they've gotten that approved. But other jurisdictions in Canada have, let's say, a different level of familiarity or comfort with the concept. And so in Edmonton, the city council put forward a motion to develop an alternative solutions guidance document, which had an architect and a code consultant work with the city's fire services and building official and planning department on a set of single-stair designs, which were aligned with the city's zoning. And then a fire engineer looked at not prescribing or creating a menu or a toolkit for how to do single-stair, but showing the approach to which one would do a risk assessment. And so through tools that in fire engineering are called fault trees and probabilistic failure, they could assess how do we make a single-stair building at 4, 5, or 6 stories as safe as or even better than a 2-stair building. And so Edmonton has put together this document that's quite helpful to understand risk assessment. But yeah, in Toronto, in Ontario, the projects that have been approved are 3-story buildings. And like I said, you can see them, you can see the floor plans at singlestair.ca. But again, every alternative solution, we always have to say this, is site-specific only. It doesn't establish a precedent, and so each one goes through its own process.
Just on Edmonton, okay? We've been through the process at Edmonton and getting approvals there. They are years ahead of most other building departments in terms of process. Like they've got a very formal process, and they lay out the process. They write down what they want, and they tell you specifically, we want fault tree analysis, written metrics, not just, hey, it's better than it was, or it's better than this, or it's objective analysis. So I find like I'd like to see them being used as maybe a showcase for how to actually do some of these projects or how to assess some of the projects. But they are definitely, if you look at the education level of their building department, their fire engineers, some of them on staff, and they have fire engineers working in the fire departments that are able to actually assess the risk from an actual real risk perspective rather than just being subjective about it. We find with the risk assessment side of it, it all depends on who's reviewing it. Whether they've got the capability or a city has an individual capability to actually review a risk assessment at that level. So we often write risk assessments differently depending on where they're going and who's going to be reviewing them. They all come out with the same result, but it depends on the capabilities of a building department. Now, Toronto's big, it probably has enough people to do something like this, but if you're going to a smaller AHJ, they may not. So Edmonton are definitely leading the front on fire engineering in Canada.
The other thing about the sort of review process, and Vancouver also put out a really good guidance document on this, is that if a jurisdiction receives an alternative solution that they feel is too complex for them to review, there's the option of following a peer review process. And so the city puts out a selection of 2 or 3 qualified third-party fire. If it's fire code related topic, it's a fire engineer. If it's something acoustics or other topics, it's someone else. But they recognize who are some subject matter experts that they consider appropriate in the field. And then you have your alternative solution third-party reviewed. And then the city is left in a situation where, okay, you've got prescriptive buildings designed prescriptively that have got the qualified professional that designed them and the municipality reviewing it. That's it. Now you're in a situation with an alternative solution where you have the qualified professional, the architect, you've got a fire protection engineer, and you've got it done by a third-party review. Once you've got those 3 levels of qualified professional engagement in the design and review of a project, a municipal building official can feel quite comfortable that what they're looking at meets the objectives and functional statements and probabilistic risk in the code. And Vancouver also puts out a really good document on that topic.
Thank you for sharing all of that. From a layman's perspective, it's a lot of work for something that seems to be, I don't want to use the word easy or simple even, something that is so common in the other parts of the world, but we have all these hoops to go through. I'm not surprised, but I'm hoping for better days. So my take from what you guys just explained is that yes, we are seeing some light at the end of the tunnel for this process. but it is not mainstream yet. So if you are not someone who's willing to be involved and potentially get your project dragged on for a little bit longer than it needs to be, this is not necessarily the right time to start exploring pushing your 3-story per se to a single-stair application. Did I get that right?
I would only add to that it depends on your design as well, because if you're looking at a narrow lot and you're going for, let's say, CMHC financing, then you're trying to score the accessibility points, it can be very challenging to try to do that. If you're in a situation where you're having to place 2 staircases, but you aren't doing a sort of front to back configuration with something side by side instead, you will notice if you run that pro forma analysis that all of a sudden you're going from, let's say it's 2 bedrooms facing the street, 3 1-bedrooms facing the back. When you do it as a single stair design, you're getting 6 2-bedroom units. So hypothetically, that's another 3 bedrooms in the building. That's increasing the pro forma by 3 extra bedrooms. If we assign, and I've done this math before, hence why I'm just spitballing it out here. If we say that a bedroom's $500 a month in rent, 3 of those 12 months of the year, that's adding $18,000 in additional annualized income to the project. So compare that, your pro forma is changed by $18,000 in income to the upfront cost of having to sprinkler the building and the approvals time delay, and do the math. And that can be an interesting equation.
That's a very specific answer. I appreciate that. Thank you for sharing it. Just before I move on to the next phase, where does the old school firescape settings happen? Like the firescape, like the metal firescapes that we used to see in older movies, and that's just gone, right?
They're just gone. Yeah, they're gone. And probably, thankfully, there's a few scary ones around downtown Toronto we get asked every now and then to look at, and we say only after a structural engineer confirms we can step on it. So they're gone. You can still do an exterior stair, okay? And that's a proper stair, though. That is a designed rise, run, whole way to ground. It's not narrow. You have to protect it from windows. You have a lot of stuff to do with it, but it's a proper stair. You can have an outside stair still, but the firescapes are not allowed in a new building. Gotcha.
That answers my lingering question there. Okay, so I guess where do we go from here? Like, where do we hope the next change will come from? What would that next change be? And in 1 to 2 years, would this become more mainstream, you think?
Where I'd like to see it go as quick as possible, but just get a Part 9 solution right in a provincial level here in Ontario. I would like to see some approach that we can just take straight away that will get it moving, and then focus on the higher buildings as well longer term. But I think there is a solution for us smaller buildings, and most of the buildings that have come to us, most of our clients have come to us with 3-4 story buildings. We haven't been asked for a 6 or a 6 that kind of height. So I'd really love with a solution right now off the shelf that said, hey, you want to do a really nice infill building? Here you go. Do this and you'll get a permit. Because the reality is there's not as many units to spread our cost across. As a co-consultant, there isn't as many units to spread the cost across that there is in a high-rise building. So that's what I'd like to, if I had a short term, that's what I'd like to see. And then longer term, get the bigger ones into the code as well.
Yeah, I think to double down on that, I think what the province and municipal building officials across the province should really ask is, if the code conditions that are in the IBC, right, they're in the model code for the entire United States, work for the US, then why wouldn't this work for us in Ontario, even if we add some additional conditions? And if it does, right, if we can recognize that those conditions meet the better level of safety, then let's codify that, because like Jack said, very small projects, they live by thin margins, and it's something that through zoning reform and through planning policy reform, DC charge, etc., we're really trying to incentivize in the province, is building 3-story multiplexes. This seems like a very obvious roadblock that doesn't require looking to Europe and Asia to remove, but simply just looking at what you can build in Buffalo.
Thank you. And amen. I agree. We've seen great movement from city, from the planning department in terms of creating a lot of opportunities for these smaller missing middle typology of projects. And we see a lot of movement in the market. The number of conversations we're having about these 3-story multiplexes is very surprisingly good from my perspective, especially in these days that the markets are still down. So yes, any hurdles and barriers that we can reduce definitely would help. Thank you both. I appreciate you taking time walking us through this. Are there any final parting thoughts that we haven't talked about? Is there anything else that our audience should know about Single-Stairs?
Jack?
Oh, I don't know. I can watch this space. It's changing pretty quick. I hope we can get some movement soon that we can hopefully be able to say, hey, this is how you get a permit. Yeah, watch Conrad's website.
Yeah, if I can self-promote here for a second, I would say singlestair.ca. It gets updated intermittently. Jack and I are also both pretty active on LinkedIn, and since Twitter died after Elon bought it, LinkedIn seems to be the place that we talk about building code now. Yeah, keep in touch there, because whenever things move, we tend to post about it.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, both. I appreciate your time, and we'll be in touch soon. Just one last thing before you leave, please make sure to visit our website. We have put together a whole bunch of different resources that you can download for free from our website. These include checklists, manuals, and also access to previous webinars. In case you have missed any of our previous webinars, you can go there, get the replay link, download the slides, and benefit from all these free resources that we've gathered on the website. Please make sure to visit. Thank you.